Mr. President.
The senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, before I begin my remarks today, I both want to recognize the wisdom and insight of my friend and colleague from the great state of Georgia. We do have unmet disaster needs in this country, and I look forward to Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about climate change, to talk about something that is a pressing and real problem that affects everyone in this country and, in fact, our world. A challenge that we can't afford to ignore any longer because the health of our families, our economy, our environment, and even our national security quite literally depend on our ability to address it and address it promptly. After a year of record-breaking extreme weather in 2018, where we saw rising average temperatures fuel California's deadliest wildfire season on record, when Florida was faced with the strongest hurricane ever to reach that state's panhandle, and when farmers in Delaware and across the country face challenges due to severe flooding and drought, it's clear we can't afford to sit back and do nothing about climate change while the American people pay the price. The costs of our inaction are real. Real in human suffering, real in disaster recovery spending, real in lost economic opportunity, and real in the burden borne by our armed forces around the world. Yes, there is a clear link between climate change and national security. The Pentagon has consistently pointed to climate change as a real national security threat that will make the military's job around the world harder. National security leaders from across administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have warned climate change acts as a threat multiplier, increasing global instability, weakening fragile states as climate change leads to more extreme weather events and scarcer food and water resources. In many ways, these findings echo themes about climate change we already know, that it's already happening, that it continues to get worse, that it's going to cost us dearly, and we can do something about it. It's that last point I want to focus on. We can do something to stop the disastrous impacts of climate change so long as we recognize it and work together in a bipartisan way to develop, take up, debate, and pass meaningful legislation that can make a difference. Democrats have a broad range of policy proposals, of bold and new policy proposals, and of tested and fully developed policy proposals to address climate change. And many of them are bipartisan. I wanted to come to the floor today to talk through 4 different bills, which I've co-sponsored, some that are relatively new, some that have been considered across several Congresses, but that are positive, constructive steps forward we can take to address climate change. First, probably my oldest bill in this field. It's called the MLP Parity Act, a very catchy name, I know. And it has 5 Republican colleagues who have co-sponsored it now over 3 Congresses. This bill expands to renewable forms of energy, to carbon capture and sequestration, and to renewable or so-called clean energy, a popular and long-established tax tool for financing energy projects that the oil and gas and pipeline sectors have enjoyed for decades. It would level the playing field. It would stop picking winners and losers in terms of energy tax policy. It would be a literally all-of-the-above energy financing strategy. And if enacted, it would be the first permanent change for the financing of clean energy projects in the U.S. tax code, potentially worth billions of new private investment in renewable forms of energy. It is also co-sponsored by the Republican chair of the Energy Committee, Senator Murkowski, the Republican chair of the Banking Committee, Senator Crapo, and 3 other colleagues from across the country. We have 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. It's had a hearing in front of the Energy Committee. It's had a hearing in front of the Finance Committee in previous Congresses. This is the sort of solid, scored, bipartisan bill that would be a meaningful step forward in addressing climate change. Senator Lindsey Graham and I have introduced the Impact for Energy Act to create a private foundation to support cutting-edge energy research and technology commercialization. Why would we do this? What am I talking about? Well, a guy named Bill Gates, one of the greatest inventors and innovators in American history, wants to deploy private investment and foundation investments alongside the Department of Energy in partnership with a lot of other individuals to significantly accelerate the cutting-edge research being done at our national laboratories through the Department of Energy. And this is a tool that several other federal agencies already have. It's a so-called private foundation that allows them to marry up private sector dollars, foundation dollars with federal dollars to leverage greater impact. This private foundation can go out and raise that additional money and add it to the energy R&D already being funded by the federal government. I also want to applaud the hard and bipartisan work of my colleagues led by Senators Murkowski and Cantwell on the Energy Committee, a comprehensive energy bill with a wide range of policy ideas that can move us forward, and several components of which I contributed and which would help address climate change. I very much hope that in this Congress we can finally take up this bipartisan bill and see it signed into law. Last, but in some ways most importantly, I want to mention a bill that I offered at the end of the last Congress with my friend and former colleague, the Senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake. Despite our very different ideological and cultural and contextual backgrounds, we're from different states, from different faiths, from different perspectives on the role of government and society. He is a real conservative, and I am a progressive Democrat. We still managed to come together and introduce a bill that addresses the cost of ignoring climate change and the impact it'll have on the people in our home states. We offer the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, a common sense bill to achieve significant and sustained emissions reductions and help mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Our bill would accomplish this by using a free market approach to pricing carbon pollution, which would spur economic growth and put money back in the pockets of American taxpayers. Similar legislation has been introduced in the House of Representatives by a bipartisan coalition, and I look forward to reintroducing this bill in this Congress. The Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act should be the centerpiece of a robust bipartisan climate agenda because it aggressively tackles emissions while optimizing economic growth and income for working families. We estimate our bill would reduce emissions by 90% by 2050, while creating as many as 2 million net new jobs in the next decade. I believe this is an efficient way to use market forces to address the very real problem of climate change while creating jobs and opportunity for American workers. Frankly, an outright ban on non-renewable sources would be inefficient and disruptive to workers from all sectors, but in particular across the building trades and other vital sectors of employment. In contrast, sending a strong market signal in favor of lower carbon or carbon neutral energy would spur investment and growth in these technologies by the private sector and lead us towards a lower carbon future through competition. We don't need to choose between clean energy and economic growth, or between combating climate change and creating jobs. These two goals are not permanently and mutually exclusive. They can go hand in hand if we craft the right policies. Still, we cannot move abruptly away from an economy that relies heavily on fossil fuels without a real and coordinated plan for the very people, the millions of Americans whose jobs will ultimately be impacted by that transition. Fortunately, the gradual transition to a clean energy future can also be an effective job creator. The renewable energy and energy efficiency sectors alone in 2017 employed 2.8 million Americans. If we place a price on carbon and then let the market work, we will create jobs across a wide range of industries, occupations, and geographies. And as we work to deal with the effects of climate change by moving to a cleaner energy and infrastructure economy, an economy that is more resilient, we'll need to rely on workers already in place in many of these industries. We'll need building trades professionals to construct and maintain our new resilient and clean energy infrastructure, manufacturing workers to build these more energy efficient products, and scientists and engineers to help research, develop, design, and deploy these new technologies. These workers bring real experience and skills to the table, and we must ensure these skills translate into new, good jobs, and that the workers in these new jobs are able to organize for fair competition, for fair compensation, for fair work conditions. We also can't tackle climate change alone. The United States is the largest historic emitter of carbon dioxide, but our emissions have been declining in recent years. Meanwhile, China has roared past us, and China and India and other countries are rapidly catching up in their carbon emissions. We need an approach that incentivizes these countries to reduce their emissions as well. The United States is a world leader in science and technology and innovation. We need to develop and advance new technologies, carbon neutral technologies, like small modular nuclear reactors and carbon capture and sequestration that we can export and then find ways to encourage countries like China and India to modernize and industrialize while also reducing their emissions. There's good work taking place in this area, and there's good solutions we can act on together. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a serious, thorough, deliberate, and thoughtful way. We need to be prepared to adapt to the ongoing impacts of climate change. We need to make sure that American workers and families aren't left behind or burdened by federal climate policy. This administration, unfortunately, strikes me as taking us backward. We are voting on an EPA administrator in this chamber who is failing to take action on climate, even action widely supported by industry. Our president just proposed a National Security Council initiative to counter the consensus around climate change and refute the idea that greenhouse gases are harmful to the environment. I shouldn't even need to say this, but that just isn't how science works. That's why here in the Senate, we need to take the opportunity to lead, to have voices in Congress and in this country from both parties that want to take bold steps to address climate. The hard part is going to be squaring these big, bold ideas with political reality. That's hard, but there are ways we can do it. Instead of being silent, we should bring this conversation to the forefront. Instead of debating whether or not climate change is real, we should be passing bipartisan bills like the ones I've mentioned today that can meaningfully address climate change and improve our economy. Climate change is a serious threat to our economy, our security, and our way of life. We need leadership from all parts of our society and government to tackle it, and we must do our part here in the Senate. I look forward to having conversations across the aisle, to working together, and to identifying real solutions to the challenges before us and to creating new opportunities for America's workers. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.